Joshua Sijuwade, can you tell us about this term religious exclusivism, especially when it comes to Islam? What does it mean?
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. So this idea is the position that salvation is accessible to a certain group. So it's an exclusive group. So if we're applying that to Islam, it would be saying that those who follow the Quran, so who we will call Muslims, salvation is exclusively available to those group of people. And then you can also find this within other religions as well, where we'll be limiting salvation to an exclusive group of people.
Yeah, terrific. So that's what is as was what is up today on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. We're going to be speaking with Joshua about exclusivism and also the controversial thesis of Fred Donner that the early Islamic community was not exclusivist at all, and the tension that might bring up with some current ideas. And it'll all be sort of focusing on a really thought-provoking article by Joshua called Islam and the Pan-Abrahamic Problem, which was just published, I think 2025, published in the journal Religions, and we'll link to that in the description of this episode. Please also take a moment to subscribe to Exploring the Quran and the Bible, like this video, all of those things, share it, etc., etc. I'm really delighted to have Joshua with us. Joshua Sijuwade is a visiting lecturer at the London School of Theology. Long list of publications, just incredible production, not only quantity, but also quality. So, check out his publications. I'll just draw your attention briefly to a couple of his books. Really recent, Analytic Theism, a Philosophical Investigation, that's Routledge 2024. And The Rational Ontological Argument, Modality, Ontology, and God, that's Bloomsbury 2025. And another book, 2025, Rational Faith, which deals with the ideas of Richard Swinburne, which will come up today in our conversation. So let's circle back, Joshua, if that's okay, to what I mentioned was a controversial thesis. Fred Donner wrote this book called Muhammad and the Believers, and everyone seemed to like it. I mean, there were some folks who said, "Oh, you're kind of, it's all wishful thinking. You're dreaming of like a utopia or something." But he basically advanced the idea that the beginning of Islam sort of, wasn't just Muslims who were opposed to everyone, but there was kind of an ecumenical community. I mean, how would you sum up Fred Donner's thesis?
Yeah, so it's exactly as what you said. So it's the idea that the early movement within Islam was a movement that included different religious groups. So what we would normally use a term would be an ecumenical group. So it was a community of believers. So Donner uses this term believers to refer to the members of that specific group. And it was inclusive theologically in the sense that if you were a righteous monotheist, and so this will normally be those who were Jews, who were Christians, and then ex-pagans, so pagans who had converted through the preaching of Prophet Muhammad, we can call them Quranic monotheists. So if we have these three, and it could have included more, but if we have these sort of three religious traditions, so you have Judaism, you have Christianity, and you have Quranic monotheism, this was sort of a movement that included theologically all of these groups. So you could be part of the community of Prophet Muhammad, even if you were part of a wider community of Christianity, of Judaism. And then also it had the idea of salvific pluralism, such that you could be saved as a Christian or as a Jew, even though you hadn't converted to what we would call today Islam. So because the movement was theologically inclusive, it included different sort of monotheistic groups. And then it was also salvifically pluralistic, such that you could be part of the community and also access salvation within your own worldview, such that you didn't have to become a Muslim before you then have access to salvation. You could be a Christian existing as a believer in the community led by Prophet Muhammad and then still be able to access salvation. And so what sort of tied together these sort of three groups of Quranic monotheism, Judaism, and Christianity under the believers community was the idea that they had to affirm the oneness of God. So they had to be monotheists. They had to affirm the idea of the day of judgment. And so they had sort of an apocalyptic worldview. And then they also had to affirm and uphold the importance of good action, so performing good works. And so if you were able to sort of affirm these three tenets within your own religious tradition, you could be part of the believers' community.
So, I mean, at first glance, or upon hearing this for the first time, it might sound pretty shocking, right? Like, I mean, I think a lot of people take for granted that from the beginning, Islam was Islam. Muslims were opposed to other communities. That Islam came to, at least sort of correct and complete Judaism and Christianity, and consequently, like the deal was, if you join this community, you're leaving those things behind. But there's actually some decent evidence for Donner's argument. I mean, as you already mentioned, the Quran is really interested in this category of belief. Iman in Arabic. So like this is really central, and I think Donner says, listen, it's actually more common for the Quran to speak of the believers than it is for the Quran to use the Arabic word Muslimun, which we usually translate as Muslims, but it could just have the Arabic meaning of the submitters. So like, I mean, Donner sort of says, like, which of these concepts is more prevalent in the Quran, belief or submission, Iman or Islam? And he says, no, it's Iman. And there's some other, I mean, I don't know if you want to refer to other arguments, or, I mean, how well does his argument hold together in your opinion?
Yeah, so I personally believe that it's a robust argument in that it's grounded on quite a wide range of evidence. And this might not be itself just developed and collated by Donner, but it's sort of been substantiated by other scholars. But the main sort of line of argumentation that Donner puts forward is, well, firstly, he sort of says we need to wrestle with the primary sources when we're trying to reconstruct early Islamic history. So instead of taking sort of what some people might say the traditional perspective of, we have the Quran, we have the Hadith literature, we have the Sirah literature, and then we sort of construct the sort of, we would say, the early Islamic historiography from that sort of point of view.
Yeah, from all those sources, right?
Yeah, he would say that, no, the way we need to do this from a historical perspective is by going with the primary sources. And the primary sources that we have during the time of Prophet Muhammad and the development of the community is firstly the literary evidence that's provided by the Quran. So he would affirm sort of an early Quranic viewpoint. Instead of saying the Quran was developed later, he would actually, against a lot of revisionists, say, no, actually the Quran is...
This is documentary evidence, more or less.
Yes, exactly. So he will sort of go with the idea that we have, firstly, the Quran as a primary source, but then he will utilize things like epigraphical evidence. So that will be things like inscriptions, papyri. He will also look at certain administrative texts and some archaeological evidence, which seems to sort of substantiate what he sees with sort of the documentary evidence. So his idea is saying that if we sort of rethink our historical methodology when it comes to Islam, what can we sort of reconstruct from that? And he believes that, as attested to by the Quranic sort of witness, and then also with sort of, as I was saying, the epigraphical and archaeological evidence, it seems to support this idea that the earliest movement within Islam was ecumenical, instead of being sort of this exclusivist community.
I would say, just to add on to that, besides saying that people should watch the interview I did with Professor Donner on this channel, but I mean, before sort of dismissing the evidence as, what I mentioned earlier, wishful thinking, because someone could say, listen, Professor Donner, you're like 21st century kind of guy. You want everyone to love each other and get along. So you're projecting this kind of 21st century ecumenical spirit back into the 7th century. No one was ecumenical in the 7th century. So I hear people say that kind of thing. But before you kind of go down that road, like, it's worth actually taking a glance at his arguments and the evidence in the Quran and some of the other things you mentioned. I mean, for example, Quran chapter 5, Al-Ma'idah, is supposed to be one of the latest, if not the latest chapter proclaimed by Muhammad, includes a verse which explicitly says, begins, Inna ladhina amanu wa ladhina hadu. So the believers and the Jews and the Christians and the Sabaeans, whoever they were, basically they're all good. Whoever believes in God on the last day has no reason for fear, and they will not be saddened, which kind of suggests that they're all going to heaven. And this is not something that really could have been abrogated if you follow this idea that maybe it's just replaced by a later verse of the Quran, because this is chapter 5. So I mean, like, you have to deal with that, like this incredible statement in chapter 5. And then also the I don't know if you want to mention it all, but there is this document in the Sira literature called the Constitution of Medina. A lot of scholars would say, okay, most of the biography of Muhammad is, basically, not sort of documentary. It's not things as they really were. It was kind of developed later, stuff that's really kind of exegesis, sort of storytelling on the basis of Quranic verse. But then a lot of people say, but Constitution of Medina stands out. And I mean, it's some sort of agreement between Muhammad and the Jews of Medina. So, I mean, there's reasons to take Donner seriously, in my opinion. So
yeah, very, very much so. So I would say, with the Constitution of Medina, you have a very, as you're sort of alluding to, scholars will see this as quite an independent source, which sort of attests to this idea outside of the Quran, that Muhammad seemed to have, even if you might not go to the position of theological inclusivism or salvific pluralism, the idea that there was a need for some form of ecumenism within Medina. And so he had sort of that attitude towards the Jews in coming to an agreement such that there was sort of a community that would then be led under him. And so I wouldn't say it's conclusive evidence that can then sort of render the probability
Right.
More probable than not for the thesis, but it seems to just add to what you have already with sort of the Quranic, as you were saying, passages which sort of seem to extend salvation towards those outside of the Quranic framework.
Yes. And then there's intriguing details from historical accounts where, for example, Omar, the second caliph, he goes into Jerusalem. Maybe these are just legends, but anyway, the stories we get of his meeting with the patriarch Sophronius of Jerusalem seem to get along pretty well. And so maybe there were Christians who fought alongside the believers in the early conquest. Okay, but just to sort of set up the problem, the Pan-Abrahamic problem that you present in this really intriguing article, which we'll link below along with some other publications, how does that like ecumenical spirit compare to your assessment of common sort of, not just, there's no way to summarize every Muslim's take on are Jews and Christians infidels, are they fellow believers? But the preponderant scholarly, Muslim believer, or the ulama, the Muslim scholars, how would you describe sort of 20th, 21st century ulama, Muslim scholar attitudes and assessment of Jews and Christians?
Yeah, so I would say there's, as you were saying exactly as well, that you can't sort of put paint with one brush sort of the perspective of all scholarship. But I do believe that there is sort of a divide between, let's say, scholars on this matter and then sort of your everyday Muslim who might have an attitude towards this. I think scholarship is more open to the idea of there being sort of an openness towards those the openness towards those who were not of the Quranic disposition, so Christians and Jews. But I don't know if most Muslims will go the full sort of walk with Donner to say that you can say categorically that there was this sort of attitude towards Muslims from the beginning of Muhammad's sort of prophetic career to the end, and then continuing with the Rashidun caliphs with sort of this idea of ecumenism being the form of Islam, which was then overtaken later. I don't think most people will go with that idea, but I think a lot of Muslims will say, well, there are, as you were saying, clear passages which seem to have sort of an openness towards Christians and Jews. But then I think there will be a pushback, because then you'll have verses which seem to speak against sort of very fundamental Christian beliefs in the Quran. So I think scholars will push back and say it doesn't seem to be as clear as what Donna was saying, because, and this is something you sort of get with other sort of revisionist scholars as well. So Patricia Crony as well would, even though she's not a Muslim, she was sort of taking Donna's position and saying, well, it just doesn't seem to take on board the whole Quranic witness.
Yes, selective, or
it's more selective. And so I think that's what most Muslims will say, is that yes, the Quran does have an openness, but it also has a very clear disdain for the, let's say, for example, the Trinitarian belief of Christians, the behavior of certain Jews towards Muhammad, and then also things like the sort of deification of Jesus of Nazareth. So
the real counterexamples one could bring up from the Quran chapter 5 verse 72 speaks of ma'wahum an-nar, meaning the refuge basically of the Christians, not the refuge at all. The final resting place of the Christians is the fire, hellfire. And I mean, just in the contemporary era, my experience, in Arab countries, I've often heard people either say explicitly directly to me or just generally, aslam taslam, become a Muslim so that you'll be safe from hell, basically. In the Aqidas, the standard creeds of Islam, there's openness to Muslims guilty of unrepented major sins being saved from the fire, and there are hadith about this. Those guys will be saved from hellfire after a certain amount of time, but not the kuffar. It's only Muslims, the sinful Muslims, who will be saved. And there are some exceptions now and then that people might say, well, Muhammad al-Ghazali, the famous, not the Egyptian, but the classical Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he says, well, a certain kind of Christian might make it. But like standard Islamic teaching, if you go to most fatwa sites, is, for example, you cannot pray for the forgiveness of a non-Muslim because God has made it clear that they'll be condemned to hell. You can only pray that they will be guided to Islam. So you can pray for their guidance to Islam, but not because God has said they're going to hell. So it's a way like insolent towards God to pray for their forgiveness. There does seem to be this tension where at least the ulama, at least the official scholars, seem to clearly say that Jews and Christians are kuffar, or at least Jews and Christians are not going to Jannah, they will not be rewarded. So there's a very clear division between the Islamic ummah and Jews and Christians outside of the ummah. So this kind of sets up the Abrahamic problem that you raised, or the Pan-Abrahamic problem you raised in the article. Can you sort of take us through your reasoning? Why is this a problem? Can't a community just sort of reflect on their sort of sources of revelation and articulate that exclusivist doctrine? What's the problem?
So the idea sort of that I sort of develop in light of Donna's thesis. So my own position as sort of a philosopher is I'm not really doing the historical work, so I'm utilizing Donna's historical work and other scholars who have developed his view. But then I sort of try and bring out the philosophical implications of this for modern thinking. And so basically in the article, I raise, as what you were saying, called the Pan-Abrahamic Problem. Basically saying that if we sort of take a conditional position of, if Donna's thesis is true, if the evidence sort of supports it, as I personally would say it does, others might disagree. But if you sort of take this position, what implications does this have for contemporary Islamic identity? Because Donna's thesis, as I was saying before, is very clear that the community that Prophet Muhammad established was an ecumenical community. It was inclusivist and it was pluralistic, specifically for monotheistic adherents. So it's an ecumenical, inclusivist community. But then, sort of as we were just saying, the sort of modern contemporary community, the Ummah, is understood to be an exclusivist community. So if you sort of have let's say a circle that you're painting in your mind of Prophet Muhammad's community, that circle would include Christian, Quranic monotheist, and Jew.
I have a larger diameter.
Yes, yeah. But if you paint a picture of the contemporary community of Islam, it would just have Quranic monotheists, and Christians and Jews will be outside of that
There's
circle.
even, I mean, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
jump in, Joshua, forgive me, but there's even like large debates over, if a Christian says to a Muslim, Assalamu alaikum, can the Muslim response,
Yeah.
wa alaikum assalam, respond that way? Or does the Muslim have to just say, wa alaikum, or because, they're not really in our community. So how do we deal with that kind of greeting? Anyway, sorry.
No, that's very helpful. So, you see that very, very clearly sort of in everyday life, but also in sort of the scholarly work. And there seems to be exclusivism being sort of taught now or held to, and inclusivism according to Donna's thesis at the beginning. So the way I sort of then look at this is by applying a criteria called the criteria of continuity and connectedness.
Okay.
So this was something that I sort of utilized from the work of Richard Swinburne, who's a philosopher of religion. And he sort of used it in a different context, specifically analyzing Christian doctrine. But then I sort of noticed that this criteria is applicable in sort of 4 different worldviews. And so you can sort of apply it to different sort of theological traditions as well. So this criteria basically says that if you want to know a community is the same community as its original community. So if you have 2 communities, and if you have the contemporary community, and you want to know if it's the same community as the original one that was established, then there needs to be an upholding of continuity and connectedness of the aims and the organization of the community. So in a more simple way, if the sort of contemporary community is the same, then it has to be organized in the same way as the original community, and it has to be holding to the same beliefs and teaching the same beliefs as the original community. If it doesn't, so if it lacks one of them, if it's organized in a different way, or if it's teaching a different thing, then you will struggle to say that they're the same community.
So the point is not that a new set of aims or a new sort of organization is like per se invalid. The point is that when you have those new aims in a new organization, you then have something new. The movement itself or the community itself is now a new community. Is that
exactly? Yeah. So something new is being generated.
Okay.
So so the main point here is this is a criteria that allows us to identify things over time. And so if I want to identify these 2 communities, and if the latter one is the same as the original, then I can utilize this criteria. And if the criteria fails, then I can just say the contemporary community is a new one, because it's
not that it's bad. It's not a value judgment. It's just something different, something new.
Exactly. Yeah. So then what I sort of do is saying, okay, if we then take on what I was saying before about Donna's community being inclusivist and pluralistic, sorry, not Donna's community, Prophet Muhammad's community, according to Donna. So if it's inclusivist,
although from what I know of Fred Donner, he's all into inclusivism. But you're speaking about Muhammad's community as presented, understood by Donner.
So if it is inclusivist and pluralist, the original community, and the sort of contemporary community of Muslims are exclusivist, then there seems to be a failure when it comes to this criteria. There seems to be a failure when it comes to the aims of the community and also its organizational structure. Why that's the case is because if you're just looking at the aims, and we can sort of call the aims in the theological context the doctrines of the community, then the contemporary Muslim community, as I was saying, if we're focusing on the doctrine of salvation, it teaches exclusivist salvation. Salvation is only available for this certain group of individuals that we call Muslims, or originally Quranic monotheists. And so what it then teaches is a specific doctrine, which I am then saying, according to the Pan-Abrahamic Thesis, wasn't upheld by Prophet Muhammad's community, because his community was salvifically pluralistic, such that Christians, Jews, and Quranic monotheists can each, within their own religious traditions, access salvation. So there seems to be a failure to uphold continuity and connectedness of doctrine between the contemporary community and the original community of Prophet Muhammad. And then if you look at the organization, so the second sort of focus of the criteria, The organizational structure seems to be different as well when it comes to the membership of the communities. So the original community of Prophet Muhammad was, again, inclusivist, so included Jews, Christians, and Quranic monotheists, or what we call Muslims. But then today, the members of the community of Islam would only include Muslims. And so the Quranic monotheists wouldn't include within that community of the Ummah, the Christians and the Jews. So what we seem to have again is a failure of continuity and connectedness when it comes to organizational structure. Now, the organizational structure doesn't have to be about the leadership. So the leaders are both the same in the community, Prophet Muhammad and Prophet Muhammad, but it's more about the membership. And so the members have now been restricted in the contemporary community when it wasn't restricted only to those who are monotheists within the original community. And so according to this criteria, then, we seem to have two different communities, because the new community or the contemporary community, because it lacks continuity and connectedness of aims and organization, seems to be a new community compared to the original one. There seems to be a transformation that took place at some certain time. This transformation could have been gradual, it could have been sudden. And I've sort of got a thesis that sort of fits with Donna's idea when this sort of took place. But the idea here is that there was a transformation that happened, such that then the original community, and this is the controversial point, but the original community of Prophet Muhammad actually ceased to exist and then was replaced by this new community.
New exclusivist.
Yes, this
community.
exclusive community.
Yeah. I'm thinking of different passages in the Quran, which Donner maybe did or could have, brought to support his argument. There's a verse which says, that God does such and such, so that mosques, masajid, or places of prostration, masajid, and churches, bi'a, I think is the Arabic word, and maybe monasteries, sawame, and there's another word in there that could be synagogues, salawat, that they not be destroyed. So it's, in other words, at this verse, maybe Surah 22, someone can correct me in the chat. This verse seems to affirm that, all of these are places that are sort of authentic sanctuaries in which God is praised.
Yeah.
So that he could definitely go with that. I mean, so I would think just to wrap up here with a couple of questions about, potential problems to the framing of the Pan-Abrahamic problem. I mean, couldn't someone say, well, listen, God continues to guide the community, or Islam is sort of established in a way that, it's basically flexible, so, the Prophet basically taught sort of guidelines to certain circumstances, so in that circumstance, he was like, listen, all of us, because, Islam has to be practical, we had to, for that, this or that reason, we had to involve Jews or Christians, but then he sort of left, like, I don't know, maybe what's the word, like a deeper internal message to Muslims but like ultimately everyone will need to affirm that I'm the Prophet, and that, the Quran is now the scripture along with the Hadith. The Bible is corrupt. You know what I mean? Like, maybe there's just more flexibility. Like, it's not that it went from 100% inclusivist to 100% exclusivist.
Yeah. Well, what someone might push back on that objection would say is that, well, if you're just sort of focusing on the primary sources, then you can't really affirm that position, because the primary sources are not so clear in this idea that even the centrality of Muhammad for the religion of Islam, the real sort of overbearing sort of proposition in the Quran is the oneness of God, and upholding that idea of Tawheed. And the Prophet has an importance, but it's not so clearly laid out as we
Mhm,
sort of
mhm.
see later on with the Hadith literature and the Sirah literature.
Yeah, the case
Yeah,
has to be made. Like Shafi'i, the famous jurist, he has to make the case basically that Sunnah is as authoritative as
yes.
Quran.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So if you're going more with what Donna does and with like people like Hugh and Cole and others with this position of let's go historically with the primary sources and then that sort of supporting evidence, then you sort of have quite a less sort of robust idea of this is what you need to affirm to be sort of part of this community of believers with Muhammad. But then also just something as well about the sort of what you were saying about the flexibility of Islam with Muhammad and sort of
yes,
its the convenience of his approach. Well, someone might say, well, according to Donna and the thesis as well, is that the sort of Pan-Abrahamic movement didn't stop with Muhammad. So it was continued with the immediate succeeding caliphs. And then even up to people like Yazid, you have sort of this continuation of
yes, yes,
acceptance of Christians and Jews.
yes.
And then Donna says it wasn't in the literature until sort of the documentary evidence that we see sort of this real radical change until the time of Abdul Malik. And so that's when you sort of see this transformation. So if it was sort of that Prophet Muhammad was doing it sort of for convenience sake, whilst the movement was growing,
Why do they keep it going?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
why did they keep it going
yeah,
instead of then just sort of saying, okay, now we've grown. Medina is, we've taken back, we've taken over Mecca as such. We
yeah.
have Medina. We're now growing with the conquest. Let's just be exclusivist. We didn't
Yeah,
sort of
but then you have cases, sorry to jump in, but just in some of the archaeological findings, like the Kathisma Church near Bethlehem or the church known as the Tomb of Mary in Jerusalem, they both have mihrabs, Islamic mihrabs, which at least suggest maybe that Muslims and Christians were praying together in those buildings. If it's okay, Joshua, just one final
yes, yeah,
question.
yeah, of course,
You're applying your philosophical training and present, and anyone who reads the article, which is open access, by the way, so you can access it through the link below, on in religions will like kind of get a sense of the way you proceed. It's a philosopher's style. So for people from an Islamic studies background, they'll be like, wait, this is like totally different from what I'm used to. But I mean, do people ever say to you like, listen, Joshua, you can't actually work, like that's just weird to like imagine that you could construct an argument that is like, you follow each step and then you're compelled to have, the outcome,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
uh maybe it's like a sort of trick lies behind this. I mean, yeah, I mean, do you have a pushback like this sort of philosophical method is not appropriate for religious questions?
Yeah, I think this is a general question about philosophy of religion. So the area of
Mhm,
philosophy that I sort of work within, which is the idea of um, sort of investigating the meaning and justification of religious claims, utilizing the tools and techniques of analytic philosophy. So any religious claim sort of is able to be analyzed and we can utilize the tools. But someone will push back and say, but religion isn't sort of amenable to that type of
mhm,
analysis. But I would just sort of say that I don't agree with that because we want with any of our sort of reasoning, any form of reasoning, we want to have valid reasoning. We want to have sound reasoning. That means we want the things that we are affirming to actually be true. And so what I'm doing in the article is saying, okay, if we are sort of, as analytic philosophy tries to do, we're trying to be as clear as possible in our reasoning.
mhm,
Where does the reasoning lead us from the position that we're affirming? So if you do affirm that the evidence supports Donna's thesis, then this is sort of the the philosophical implications that sort of
mhm,
lead or entailed by this position. And so what I sort of do at sort of the end of the article, I sort of show, well, these are the different implications of this. So you could reject the thesis, you could decide to utilize the thesis, and it sort of leads to maybe the reform of Islamic history.
mhm.
It can
Returning
lead
to
to the rejection
inclusivism.
of,
Yeah.
the position. So my whole point is of saying that I think with any form of reasoning, clear reasoning is important, and the
Mhm,
tools that we utilize in philosophy are very useful in clarifying the meaning and also the justification of religious claims, and that can be and it hasn't been done a lot in Islam, but I think as it's sort of been done more in Christianity with Christian history, I think it can bear a lot of fruit within sort of an Islamic framework as well, in support of Islamic claims and also in sort of critique of it as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Joshua. This sort of, you're at the vanguard of philosophy of religion and its possible engagement or possible intersections with Islamic studies. The article is Islam and the Pan-Abrahamic Problem. We'll link to that and some other things of Joshua in the description. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, etc., etc. Joshua, I really enjoyed connecting, and this hopefully is not the last time. I look forward to doing it again.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Thank you for inviting me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.